atmosphere. Great, well thank you all for coming. This is so exciting, the launch of the Warwick chapter. Especially Chris, who's been one of my best friends for a good few years now. So I think it's absolutely fantastic you're all here to celebrate the launch of a new chapter of Giving What We Can. And so following on from Chris, I'm Will Crouch. I co-founded Giving What We Can in 2009 with the aforementioned Toby Ord, now the Managing Director, responsible for all the boring running parts of it. And I'm going to be talking about taking giving seriously. And it's going to be a little bit of a personal story about myself that will then move into discussion of charity cost effectiveness and discussion of giving what we can as an organisation. And it's going to start with the idea that I'm sure many of you share, that you want to make a difference in the world. But when I always thought about that, I thought it was a kind of odd phrase. So odd in a couple of ways. The first is that it just says make a difference. It doesn't say you should make a positive difference. So I mean, if you go and you kill someone, then you've kind of made a difference to the world. It's presumably not really a good thing that you want to do. In fact, the UK Army actually advertises itself with the slogan, make a difference. And I think it's kind of exploiting this loophole. But the other aspect is the and, which I find interesting. When there are many ways of doing good in the world, why should we only be focused on making a difference? Why should we not try and make the most difference? Why should we not try and do as much good as we can with our lives? So, I started to think about this, and I thought, how much good could I do if I really tried? And of course, there are various ways in which I can do good in the world. There's my work, there's my personal relationships, there's my spare time, my volunteering time. But in order to get a decent grip on this, the issue, I just started thinking about my money. So, as an academic, not particularly well paid compared to the other careers I could have pursued, I earned about £1.5 million over the course of my career. So the question is, how much could I give if I really wanted? And I'm a graduate student at the moment. I'm really pretty happy on that salary. Doesn't seem like I'd significantly be happier on a higher salary. And if I lived as a graduate student for the rest of my life, I'd only need about £500,000 of that £1.5 million. So that kind of sets up the question of how much could I give? What could I do with this £1 million? But in order to answer this question, you just need to know, well, how much good can that money do? So we'll talk a little bit about giving better. So, if I want to use this money to do as much good as possible, where should I give it? Now, in the kind of current discussion in public discourse around charity cost effectiveness, the metric often used is percentage administration costs. The idea is you look at all the money goes in, you look at, for any charity, you look at how much is spent on the program, how much is spent on administration costs, fundraising, overheads, salaries, and you take that ratio, and the lower the ratio, the better the charity. But it seems like this just can't be the right metric, for a number of reasons, but in particular, just what a program a charity implements is, seems to be more important than how much administration is spent. In particular, if a charity had minimal admin but was supporting a really silly cause, should we fund it? So suppose that what I'm really passionate about, my driving passion in life is buying donuts and giving them to hungry police officers. This is the thing that I just think is the most important thing I could be doing. And so let's suppose I set up a charity doing this, and I'm so thoroughly passionate about it, there's absolutely zero administration costs. I pay for any administration out of my back pocket. I don't take a salary myself and so on. So according to this metric, my charity would be the most cost-effective possible charity because I was spending absolutely nothing on administration costs. But surely this can't be the best charity in the world. In particular, it's just not doing much good. In fact, maybe it's even doing net harm. Donuts for police officers aren't the most important thing that we could be spending our money on. Hopefully that's an understatement. If you actually agree with it, you might want to leave the lecture, things will get more complicated. So the most important question is, for every dollar given to the charity, how much benefit do people receive? And you might think that's just a super difficult question, how can we answer that? But luckily there's a variety of economic research, especially with health and development economics, we're giving to the global poor, that can help us to answer that question. And if you look at that research, you'll find that the greatest range in cost effectiveness comes from the type of intervention that the charity is implementing, rather than how much it spends on administration, or how effective it is as a charity in general. So to give an illustration of thinking about charity cost effectiveness or intervention cost effectiveness in the right way, let's consider smallpox. So in the 20th century, in order to get a sense of scale, we could think about the problem of war. Now, war is quite a big problem, and in fact, in the 20th century, it killed a lot of people. Between all political famines, genocides, and wars combined, it killed about 188 million people. Smallpox, in terms of lives lost, was actually a bigger problem than this. It killed 300 million people. But we managed to eradicate it in the early 1970s. And what was remarkable about this was not just the size of the achievement, but also how cheap the intervention was. So when it was eradicated in the 1970s, it was killing about 2 million people per year. So the eradication of smallpox has saved about 122 million lives and counting. But it only cost $1.4 billion to do this. That works out, if you do the maths, at just $12 per life saved. Now that's a phenomenal amount of good that you can do with such a very small amount of money. And so if we're trying to think about doing good in the world and where to spend our money, we want to be looking at interventions like smallpox eradication, and not like giving donuts to hungry police officers. So, you might think, using this example of smallpox, it's like, okay, how I should be thinking is just, what's the price at which I can save someone's life? And I should just spend money on whichever charity saves someone's life with the lowest amount of money. But that's not quite right. The reason is no one's actually ever saved a life. That might kind of seem surprising, but if you think about it, you might have someone on the ground having a heart attack, and the doctors defibrillate them and save their life, but then lo and behold, 30 years later they go and die from something else. And it seems like that's going to happen to everybody. Everybody's going to die. So you never save a life if that means just extending their life indefinitely. All you can ever do is extend their lives by a greater or lesser extent. And it seems to be important to extend their lives by more rather than less. If you jump in front of a bus to save someone from the incoming bus and then just chuck them in front of a train, giving them a minute extra life, you haven't really benefited from that much. So you could think about, okay, how many life years could we save? That would be a way of taking that into account. But it's not quite the right way to think about things either. In particular, there's two ways I could benefit someone. I could benefit them by extending their life, but I could also benefit them by increasing their quality of life, by just making their well-being or happiness or general quality of life better when they're alive. And within health economics, the kind of gold standard approach to measuring cost effectiveness of an intervention is the quality adjusted life year, or QALY, as it's shortened to. And this takes into account both the quality and the quantity, and it's the standard approach. And you might think, well, how can we measure quality? How can we trade off improving the quality of someone's life against extending their life? And it's just done with survey data. So of the people that you're trying to meet, you just ask them to make certain sorts of trade-offs between would they like a certain quality of life but live for longer, or an even better quality of life but live for a shorter amount of time. And one way to think about this, and to get a sense of what a quality adjusted life is actually worth, is to think about what the NHS would be willing to spend. So, within the UK, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence has to make a decision about what drugs it needs to fund, because some are too expensive, and it would mean that other people wouldn't be able to be treated for more easily preventable or easily treatable diseases. So when it reviews different drugs that it could fund, if it costs less than £20,000 to give one person, or many people, the equivalent of one quality adjusted life year, but that just means 1 year of extremely high quality health, then it'll just go ahead and do it. If it's between £20,000 and £30,000, then it'll make a kind of judgment call, and if it's above £30,000, then it'll only fund that intervention or drug type if there's been like a real political campaign. So it's actually a pretty good deal. In order to think about that, you might not have £20,000 at the moment. You might think about the kind of future trade-off. So you might think, okay, I have 2 courses of life open to me. I could live on a salary of £30,000, or I could live on a salary of £20,000 but be blind. And so if you all think about, what sort of, which of those two options would I prefer? Certainly in my case, I prefer to live in the, I said it the wrong way then. So you can either live on a salary of £20,000 and not be blind, or you can live on a salary of £30,000 but be blind. And if you're like me, you'll prefer the £20,000 but be fully sighted and fully healthy to £30,000 but being blind. And if that's true, then it means that you value a quality adjusted life year at more than £20,000. So even that cost is a pretty good deal. But can we gain a quality adjusted life year for less than this? And the answer is we can. In fact, a lot less, 1,000 times less. And to see this, we can consider the case study of preventing and curing HIV/AIDS in the developing world. Okay, we'll start off with treatment of Kaposi sarcoma. So this is a certain sort of cancer. It's an AIDS-defining illness. What that means is that if you've got HIV and then you get Kaposi sarcoma, then by definition you have AIDS. So it's kind of on the cusp of the quality adjusted life year barrier. Probably is still worth monetary investment, but it would be a kind of moot call about whether the NHS funds it. But luckily there are other interventions we can do in the developing world that are far more cost effective again. So antiretroviral therapy is about 10 times as cost effective. Another now preventative treatment for HIV/AIDS, prevention of transmission during pregnancy, just using drug-based treatment. Several times more cost effective again. And where that means is you're providing several times a greater health benefit for the same amount of resources than if you were spending it on antiretroviral therapy. Consider that again to something well known for being extremely cost effective, condom distribution. We're now in preventative measures rather than treatment. Again, we're doing something like twice as good again, helping twice as many people to the same degree for the same amount of money. And this is already pretty impressive. You'll see that treatment of Kaposi sarcoma is like, you can barely even see it in the graph now, because the difference between distribution of condoms and treatment of Kaposi sarcoma is so great. But if we're thinking about how to get the best bang for our buck within HIV/AIDS, well, why should we only be focused on that? Why should we pin our maths to just one sort of cause, rather than thinking, well, I just want to benefit people. I want to alleviate suffering in the developing world. I shouldn't really care if that's through HIV/AIDS or through some other cause. And so we can consider other sorts of interventions. And in particular, distribution of insecticide-treated bed nets do fantastically well again. So again, you get double the sort of cost effectiveness. You're now giving people the equivalent of almost 60 years of very high quality life for every £1,000 you spend. And that's really pretty remarkable. So what can we learn so far? Health programs in developing countries can be exceptionally cost effective. People are extremely poor in the developing world. So those figures that you often hear, that 1.4 billion people live on less than $1.25 per day, often you might think, oh, well, it's okay because money goes so much further in the developing world. But what isn't often expressed in that figure is that figure that already takes that into account. So what $1.25 per day means is that people in the developing world live on the equivalent of $1.25, what $1.25 would buy in the US in 2005. And if you try and think about that, it's like, what could that buy? Something like a bag of rice. And for that reason, health programs in developing countries can be amazingly cost effective. 1,000 times more so than in the UK. Also 1,000 times more so than is necessary to do a good deal. In fact, I'd call it the best deal you'll ever see in your life. I mean, if you think about going out for a restaurant or buying any sort of product and think, oh, I want an iPod or something, and get that for £1,000, or I could buy it for £1. You'd never see that in the market. But this is the way it is in terms of giving to charity. And the reason is that you still see this incredible discrepancy between how much you can benefit yourself and how much you can benefit others. Is just this one catch. But in terms of this amazing deal, which we could describe as like a 99.99% off sale, or 100,000% extra free. The only catch is that the beneficiary isn't you. Okay, so what was my response? And the response of many members of Give What We Well, I thought about my possibilities. So I had two paths open to me. Firstly, I could live on $1.5 million, an average income of about £40,000 as an academic, spending that on myself. Or I actually miswrote that. So I could spend 0.5 million on myself, living as a slightly more, about the level of a graduate student, and I'd be able to donate £1 million over the course of my life. Now, how much good would that do? A huge amount. In fact, it would save tens of thousands of bodies, save hundreds of thousands of lives. That made it somewhat scary, but really the obvious choice. And I thought it was pretty cool, so I chose that path. So I pledged to give everything I earn about £20,000. That's about 50% of my income over the course of my life. And currently, even on my graduate stipend, I actually find that really quite easy to live on, so I give about 20 to 30% of that too. That will amount to considerably more than £1 million over the course of my life. So here's a way to think about getting involved. I'll tell you a little bit more about giving what we can now. So we are an organisation that is incredibly concerned about global poverty, and really trying to take this problem seriously, and like I said at the start, trying to make not just a difference, but trying to make the most difference for people in the developing world. And it has two aims. It encourages people to give more. So if you look at this graph and you think of this squares representing the total impact that a typical charitable donor will have in their life, where they give, I think, 0.7%, the average, and people tend not to really think about cost effectiveness, so they don't give it that cost effectively. There are two things we can do. So first, we encourage people to give more. I'll, for example, be giving, if you give 10%, you'll be giving about 15 times as much as you would otherwise have given. Which would be amazing. You can increase your impact by 15 times at incredibly small amount of self-sacrifice. And we encourage people to give more effectively. So by giving to the most cost-effective charities, you can improve the impact you have with the money you give by a factor of 100 or a factor of 1,000. That means the total impact you can have is something like 15,000 times as much as you would have had if you'd just been spending that much smaller amount, less cost effective. And also the interesting thing about this is that you might think, wow, I'm giving 50% of my income, that's like this huge deal. But actually the much more important decision I made was to give wisely rather than to give more. The amount by which I increase my impact by giving to the most cost-effective charities is much more than the amount I increase my impact by deciding to give 50%. So, let's talk about the reaction of the organisation, the reaction to this idea. We have been rapidly growing, so we now have over 200 members, I think 205, including a number of famous ethicists. Some of you might have heard of Peter Singer or Thomas Pogge, and also famous development economists as well, like Michael Kramer and Rachel Glenn stood at Harvard. We got an awful lot of interest from the media. I'll only be able to mention some of the newspapers that we've been featured in. We're featured in the Financial Times, I think every major broadsheet in the UK, also the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. The media just seemed to be really taken by this idea of giving a large proportion of your income because you take these problems so seriously. We also had interviews with the BBC. Total pledges come to more than £45 million or $75 million. You might have thought that 200 members really isn't that much, but each person is really making quite a sizable contribution. And that means that together we've pledged this huge amount of money. And in the past 2 years we've moved about $1.7 million to the very best charities. So where charities we recommend are Schistosomiasis Control Initiative, Deworm the World, and Against Malaria Foundation. So you might find that the most cost-effective charities also tend to have the worst names. Kind of apologize for that. So if you want to quantify this again, thinking about the benefit that these donations produce, there'll be about 3 million bodies. We now have chapters in Oxford, Cambridge, Princeton, Rutgers, Harvard, and now Warwick. You'd like to give yourself a cheer if you want. I'm serious. So yeah, and this is absolutely growing. There's a fantastic scene now, an absolutely huge community in all of these places. awful lot of students really getting behind the idea of really trying to take problems like low poverty as seriously as possible, and really trying to make a difference. Now let's talk about your opportunity. So, every new member that's given what we can, if they pledge 10% of their incomes over the course of their life, they make roughly an £200,000 as a lifetime donation. And that'll be the same for you as well, or maybe even more. We tend to be conservative. That would be over 10,000 qualities, or 400 lives saved. And it's worth really pausing to think seriously about this. Saving one life is incredibly impressive. Look how great a guy that is. He saved a cute little puppy. But you can do far more than this. You can be this hero that's valued hundreds and thousands of times over. You each have the opportunity to save hundreds of thousands of lives just by making a relatively small change in the way you spend your money over the course of your life. There's a truly tremendous opportunity that each and every one of us have. So let's take it.
Caroline Fiennes, and as you know, my background is, I know there's lots of people here who are doing maths and physics and or philosophy. Put your hand up if you're doing maths or physics or philosophy in your degree. Oh, good. Okay, so my degree is in physics and philosophy, so that's relevant terrain, which is very relevant, I think, to this whole discussion about giving well. And then I worked in business for quite a long time, and then have spent about the last 10 years working with donors and funders and charities, mainly on the business of getting them to give more effectively. And I've also been a chief executive of a charity myself, and so I've kind of been on the receiving end of some of this. Will has said some of the stuff that I was going to talk about, so I'm now going to live completely reorganise my presentation. The thing that I want to talk about is how, if you are giving what you can, or if you're giving any amount of time or money, even if you choose a great organisation, there is still a big variation in the amount of difference that you might do. So even if you choose a great organisation to give money to, you can still screw it up actually quite badly. And I've been on the receiving end of some of that, and I'm going to tell you some war stories about that. And I'm also going to show how you can give money or time or anything else in the ways that will enable it to achieve most. So what I do, in my work is work with donors and funders, and of course I am in the business of persuading people to give more. But I'm also in the business of persuading people to give in a way which is better, because as the name of my recently published book implies, it ain't just what you give, but the impact that comes out of the end is very much determined by the way in which you give it. I mean, it's not so dissimilar actually to anything else. The way in which the returns that you get from investing, for example, the returns that you get from teaching a lesson or whatever, are very much dependent on the way in which you do it, and that's very much true here. So often in the charitable world, people think about what you might call the sort of stock selection, the choice of organisation that they back, and that, sure, is really important. You won't find a professional chef starting with bad ingredients. There's a good reason for that. But nonetheless, there are still ways that you can make those great ingredients into something amazing or something, frankly, pretty disastrous. So that's what I want to talk about. The story I wanted to start with is, like I said, I've worked for quite a number of years advising donors and funders about their giving. And actually, I started to pull this together into a book, and the idea sort of came to me when I was staying in Hope, which is a village in Derbyshire, some of you might have been to. And it's kind of funny because in Hope there is almost no economic activity at all, apart from servicing hikers like myself and my husband who were there. But there is a cement factory, and this is their sign. I just think this is kind of boring. And so we were staying in Hope. We weren't staying precisely in Hope. We were staying a little bit outside the village of Hope. We were staying between the villages of Hope and a village called Chaton. This is the sign to Chaton. And at the time, I was the chief executive of the charity, and it seems to me that being between Hope and being in Chaton was actually not so different to the experience of being the chief executive of the charity. Because, Hope, of course, charities have in abundance in terms of their mission and the change that they're trying to create. and the work that they're doing for their beneficiaries in that fashion. But you would be surprised about the extent to which they get shut on by people who are ostensibly trying to help them. So sometimes trustees, or the regulator, or government, or often actually donors and funders. So so I keep looking at my notes because I'm actually changing quite a lot what I'm going to say now. So I'll tell you a story. This is a true story. And the last time I told this, the person that it's about was in the room, so I had to amend it quite a lot. That when I was running this charity, there was a particular grant-making foundation that we thought might well support us. And so we approached them, I knew them, so we approached them for some money, and there was a great long period of fucking around. And we had to, fill in application forms and blah, blah, blah. And then eventually they said that they were going to give us a grant, which was great, of £5,000. Which when you've got a team to pay and we were doing activities, it kind of helps. But I reckoned that actually the amount of time that we had spent, the sort of man hours, if you will, that we'd spent on their application process, it probably already cost us actually about 1,500 quid. And then they invited us to apply for this other program that they ran. And I said, really? But we don't really fit into that program. And they said, yeah, we're changing it. Actually, we're changing it sort of in your direction. So, you will fit in it. And I said, okay. So that had a really complicated application process that was separate. So we applied for all that. And that took about another grand, maybe 1,500 quid worth of time. So, you do the maths. And then, because we were one of their grantees and the grant lasted for 2 years, we had to go to various conferences and go to their trustee meetings and talk to them and blah, blah, blah. And that was probably about another grand worth of time that it consumed. And at the end, they said to us, okay, now you've got to fill in a form about and report on the impact that you've made with this grant. And I was like, well, what grant? You've kind of spent it all by now. And so there was I tell that story because, of course they had found a great organisation, we were very happy. But the way that they gave it was such that it hardly did any good at all, because there was kind of hardly any of it actually left. There's quite a neat concept that people in charities talk about, but not enough, which is about the net grant. So in that instance, we started off with £5,000, and you kind of chip away a piece by the application process, and you chip away a piece by the reporting, and chip away the other things, and the net grant you end up with in that instance was about 20%, if that. And my estimate is that quite often net grants are about 50% maybe. On occasion they are, like the experience I had, they're very low. They are quite often nil, and they are occasionally negative. So I came across an experimental physicist at Columbia who reckoned some of his grants were net negative. So this is what I mean, the importance about the way in which it's given. And clearly that example is from a big foundation, and one day you will be millionaires and you'll have foundations, and remember that story. But it also pertains to giving at a much smaller level. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few things. This may change on the way through. One is about so the case for caring about this stuff. I want to add some stuff to what Will said about why administrative costs, which people often think about, are no guide. Thirdly, I'm going to talk a bit about why it's so hard for donors to know if they're doing a good job. Why have you ever bothered writing a whole book about this stuff? And then fourthly, about what as an individual you can do. Okay. Will's talked a bit about the analysis in terms of qualities. One of my favourite examples is in Kenya. One of the biggest killers of children is diarrhea, which you can alleviate by getting chlorine into the water. And there are various mechanisms that people use for doing that, which include putting, because in villages the water sources are not organised, right? So you have to actually someone has to put the chlorine in. Here we'd have to do it because it's already been done somewhere. But mechanisms for that include taking water, getting people to take chlorine round to individual homes. That's option A. Option B is that you get people in the village to go pick it up from a shop or some central distribution point. Or thirdly, you give it out at the water source. So where people go to the well when they get there. Okay. So all of which sound like quite sensible mechanisms, right? So which one would you think would be the most effective? Like, will you have an opinion about which would be most effective? Like, hands up if you reckon you would be able to figure out which of those would be the most cost effective. Right, no, of course you wouldn't, because like, why the hell would you? Because they all sound quite sensible, right? But it turns out there's a massive variation in the cost effectiveness. And, you know, and consistent with what Will's saying, it's not 10% or 20%, it's 100% in this instance. So here's the graph, is that if you deliver chlorine to people's homes, then for every $1,000 that you put in, you'll manage to prevent 300 of cases of diarrhea. Whereas one of the other options is more than twice as effective as that. And this clearly, I show this by way of demonstrating, firstly, that there's a massive delta. So there's a massive difference. So it's really worth, getting the right organisations. And clearly that sort of opportunity cost, if you will, is my sort of driving passion, and I guess that's shared with many of you, in the room. But secondly, that choosing a great charity and also choosing the best ways of doing it is fundamentally a comparison business. Okay? So it's not really that helpful to analyse a charity in isolation, just as actually it's not that helpful to analyse a university in isolation, or a doctor, or a company stock, for example. If I say to you that I'm looking at a mining company and the price-earnings ratio is 8, I don't really tell you anything unless you know what you'd expect it to be for other companies. So it's always worth doing the comparison here. There are other instances, and Will alluded to these, where the delta is much bigger, even in the 100% that we've got here. Another of my favourites I used to teach in Tamil Nadu is about getting kids into schools in southern India, and there are various barriers. And actually, one of the things I noticed when I was teaching is that loads of kids don't come to school. So you might have a class which nominally has 25 kids, but you will hardly ever have 25 kids in the class, because absenteeism is massive. And I sort of noticed this casually, but other people have actually gone to bother finding out why, what's going on and trying to prevent it. And again, there are various different mechanisms that people use, two of which are solving the problem of parents taking their kids out of school when they are to work in the fields or to look after younger siblings. And so a kind of preventative solution to that is to pay the parents when kids turn up at school. It's called a conditional cash transfer. And then another mechanism is dealing with the fact that loads of kids in those countries have intestinal worms. Like, weird fact that 1 in 4 kids globally, 1 in 4 people globally has some form of intestinal worms. And it turns out that dealing with the intestinal worms is amazingly cheap. It's like 25 times cheaper than a conditional cash transfer. And so what that means is that if you put a conditional cash transfer program, if you put $1,000 in, it will give you an additional year of schooling for one child. Whereas if you put it into a deworming program, even an expensive one, it'll cost $40 per child, so you'll get 25 children into school for an additional year. So there's this massive variation. So I want to use that as an example to talk about administrative costs. So here in that example, if you had $10,000 and you put it into a conditional cash transfer program, then you would manage to get 10 children into school for an additional year, right? Now, if you put that $10,000 into a deworming program, right, which costs $40 per child, okay, you get a lot more than 10 kids in school. Now suppose that the deworming program was run really badly, and suppose that it had a big problem with like fraud or embezzlement or something, okay? And suppose that 95% of its revenue disappeared, just got embezzled out of the way, or just got spent on shoes and handbags, or got spent on something totally irrelevant, okay? So they were of the £10,000 that we were starting with. Can we just have one conversation with them? Then of the £10,000 that you were starting with, we only had 500 quid that was left, okay? Well, then something quite weird happens. Is that here we've only got 500 quid left, but because deworming only costs 40 quid a throw, even with 95% getting 12 children into school, and we've got 20 o'clock left over. So because it's so much cheaper, that even if there's so much wasted, we're still getting a better result. Now, suppose that wastage is what everybody talks about in terms of the administration costs or the overhead costs in the organisation. Well, what this shows is that even if fully 95% is being completely squandered on stuff that's completely irrelevant, it's still doing a better job. So I just wanted to show you this by way of the maths, actually, of showing that administration costs or overhead costs or even wasted or whatever is actually no guide to what comes out of the end. I mean, clearly this is an extreme example because the deworming is so much better, so much more cost effective than other interventions. But even if it were only twice as good, you can imagine that nearly half the money could still be wasted and it would still outperform the other program. Okay. One of the issues that there is as a donor in choosing a strong organisation, and when I want to go into a bit of theory, okay, and I'm figuring that if you guys are interested in giving what you can over the course of your careers, you will need to understand this at some level, is that giving to a charity, or the work that a charity or that a social or development program does, is so fundamentally different to a normal commercial transaction. And I'm going to labour this point a bit and go into some of the details, that all manner of kind of surprising things arises from this. And I'm going to labour it because we are all so used to dealing with commercial transactions, with taxi companies or, hairdressers or cafes or, landlords or whatever. And the analogy is really quite unhelpful in many respects. So, so let's think about a normal commercial transaction. Let's suppose that I'm selling you some cake, right? So in that, you give me some money, I use the money that you give me to make some cake. You are the consumer of the cake. If you like the cake, you get the value from what your money has produced. Okay? You are the person who's providing the money is the person to whom the benefit is delivered. And if they like it, they can buy more, and the money that they provide to the supplier can be used to create more of the product. And it's a cycle, and it can keep going around, okay? And it can go sort of infinitely. This is not what is going on in a charitable program. In a charitable program, the charity is serving a beneficiary, which might be an individual or a building or an animal or whatever, or the environment, or God, or the dead, or the unborn, or whatever. All kinds of beneficiaries who, for whatever reason, cannot pay the full cost of the service that they need. Okay? And therefore, they need the cost to be picked up by someone else, that is by a donor. So you end up with this kind of open system where, if you think about this from the charity's perspective, if you imagine yourself at the top, on the one hand, you're dealing with people who are the source of your money, your donors. And on the other, you're dealing with beneficiaries who are to whom you're delivering a service. And they are different people. They are often very different people. So, quite comically, I live in London, people just live in different parts of town. In general, the money lives, in the west, and the beneficiaries tend to live in the east. And the charity's job is moving resources from one to the other. But the types of activity that you do to deal with these two different sides of the operation are really quite separate. And so it's worth understanding that charities often run two completely separate businesses. The business of dealing with donors might involve, organising fun runs, or, putting chuggers in the street, or getting places in the London Marathon, or organising jumble sales or whatever. And the business of dealing with beneficiaries might involve, running a refugee camp, or doing work with rainforests, or whatever. I mean, they're completely separate things. Often, they're sort of almost comically different, actually. And there's often, charities will have the teams of people that deal with them not co-located, and they will have quite different skill sets. Often, they actually look quite different. So literally what you wear is quite different. I remember a day when, I was sort of doing both of these and had to, I had to get changed in the middle of the day, because what you wear when you're going out to see a hedge fund to talk to them about money is not the same as what you wear when you go to a homeless hospital in the East End. And so this separation between the donor and the beneficiary kind of influences everything. It means that, for example, because the donor isn't, it's also the beneficiary isn't you, it's that donors don't naturally know whether a charity is doing a good job for its beneficiaries. So in the example we discussed about the Kenya water, right? If you were, choosing which organisation to give to, you wouldn't naturally know which one is the best because you're not in the refugee camp or in the domestic violence refuge or in the homeless centre or whatever, and therefore you're like, as a donor, how would you know if they're doing a good job or not? Sometimes you can, measure it quantitatively, but often you can't. Whereas in the cake example, you know whether the cake is any good or not because you're the one eating it. Whereas in this world, you don't. All sorts of things follow from this. As a result, donors often don't choose the best charity because it's very hard for them to do it. So one of the corollaries is don't just copy. Don't just copy what other donors are doing, even if they are, well-known or famous or rich or whatever, because they're separated from the beneficiaries just as much as you are. So, just because, Oprah or whatever, is promoting some charity like Warwick, why? The only reason to follow what another donor is doing is if you have some reason to believe they've gone and got that data, they've gone across that sort of horizontal divide and they've understood that. It also means, of course, that because the donor is not, as it were, eating their cooking, they're not the beneficiary. To speak very bluntly, they don't have a normal incentive to do a good job. If you're buying cake, you have every incentive to find the best place for that. Whereas if you're a donor giving to a charity, you don't quite in the same way, because it's not you that feels the pain. That delta that we looked at on the graph isn't felt by you as a donor, it's felt by someone else whose chances are, you will never meet. And so the industry just sort of plays out, really very differently. I have, in my life, heard donors say things like, any good charity, after a while, doesn't need subsidy. So after a while, any good charity will be able to earn its own revenue, and it will sort of get weaned off needing donations. And you can see, I hope, from this diagram why that is completely untrue. Because you don't need the bill at the bottom actually, but fundamentally, the charity is serving beneficiaries who can't pay. So it needs subsidy from somewhere else. And actually, the more of its work that the charity is doing, the more subsidy it's going to need. Which, by the way, creates a kind of nightmare for actually running an organisation, because the more demand there is for your service, the more difficult it becomes to fund it. Right? In a cake shop, the more demand there is, the more money you get, so it sort of becomes easier. Right? Whereas in the charity world, it kind of becomes worse, because you've got to get more and more dinners and do more and more completely different jumble sales and fund runs and stuff to fund the work that your beneficiaries want you to do. So actually, if a donor swaps out of a charity, that simply creates some cost that that the charity will incur for having to find another donor. So I want to talk a bit then about, what can you as an individual do? We can talk a bit about how you find a great organisation. But I want to talk also about some of the ways in which you give it and how that can make a big difference. So one of the most important and easiest in a way, is about making any gifts that you make unrestricted. So which means giving it without kind of ring fencing it, or without any stipulations about how money can be used. Very common actually, because donors can't naturally sort of see and understand what an organisation is doing, is they stipulate what an organisation must do with their money. I want it spent on this programme, or to buy teachers or minibuses or whatever. And that sort of sounds like a good idea because it gives them more control. In fact, it's a terrible idea. And here's why. Imagine that you are an aid agency, say, and you are running programmes in Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand, right? And suppose, for simplicity, that each of those is managed by a separate, restricted pot of money. Well, fine, so everything sort of carries on. Suppose that the Malaysia programme comes in under budget, right? So it has a surplus. And suppose that at that same time that Indonesia suffers from some natural disaster, there's an earthquake or a tsunami or something. Well, obviously what you want to do if you're an aid agency is take the surplus that you've got from one country and use it in another. But if they are restricted pots of money, you can't do that. And often a charity can go back to a donor and negotiate to get the thing, the restrictions lifted so they can do it. But that all takes time and it all takes money. And frankly, if you've got a tsunami, you don't really have a lot of time. And so money gets wasted and time gets wasted in faffing around dealing with the restrictions. And they are so arduous and odious that charities say that they would rather have 100 quid that's unrestricted than 150 quid that's restricted. That is to say, if you make your donation restricted, you immediately can lock off about a third of the value for it. So this is one of the most important things that you can do. You can see this even actually in an easy way with when you buy Oxfam goats for each other for Christmas, that the Oxfam did thing, and there are other people who do something. Is that normally when you buy them, partway through the purchase process, there's a little box that you can tick which says, hey, Oxfam, actually, you can use my 25 quid or whatever for whatever you see fit. And this is a fine thing to do because, in principle, tomorrow, all 20 million adults, or 30 million adults, whatever, in the UK could go to Oxfam and buy a goat and stipulate that Oxfam has to buy a goat. Well, Oxfam may not need 30 million goats by the end of the week. It may need whatever it needs in those communities. And the wrong people to be making the decision about precisely what goes to these communities is, you or I, when we're in the high street, we have 20 minutes and we're trying to buy a gift for our mate. The right people to be making those decisions are development experts and indeed the communities themselves. So the thing about restricting is that it sort of grabs some of the power and control, or the donor grabs some of the power and control at the expense of beneficiaries having that power and control themselves. And this to me is really where the anger and the real problem comes from, is that fundamentally this is about restrictions denude beneficiary communities of their self-determination, of their ability to decide for themselves what they want. You really see this in public health, actually, in that there's some horrible number, like 90% of, well, it's true that 90% of spending on global health goes to about 10% of the, not 10% of the diseases, but it goes to sort of 10% of the people who are affected by a particular disease. There's total mismatch. And it's also the case that there's a complete mismatch between where the money goes and where the affected communities would actually want it to go. So if you kind of survey people in the affected countries, they're not getting what they want. And it's partly because of this separation that donors can decide and do decide without the right data. And it's partly because donors often don't reach out to those communities to invite them to be part of the decision-making process. One of the big exceptions to that is the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the charity that operates Wikipedia, who, as you might expect, when they come to do their strategy for giving, they did it all in kind of totally open source way. Uniquely, actually, amongst foundations that I have ever seen. They did it through a wiki, so anybody could go on and comment on their strategy, and they ended up with zillions of comments, and therefore I think a much stronger organisation that came out at the end of it. In terms of looking at the types of organisations that you might choose to give to, people often say there's no right answer and there's no wrong answer about the type of cause that you should support. And this, may be an interesting kind of philosophical question or whatever. I personally am more interested in the data. This is a graph about charitable activity in the UK, and it shows that there may not be a right answer or a wrong answer, but the amount of money that is spent by charities or is available to charities working in mental health in the UK is about 700 quid per beneficiary, per person with a mental health issue. For people in prison, the amount of support they can pledge is about £1,000, whereas the donkeys in the donkey sanctuary get about £2,000 a year each. So, one thing that you might choose to look at in your decisions, whatever decisions you choose to make about your giving, is the relative undersupply and oversupply of funding into particular organisations. This is really a manifestation, I think, of the separation in action. Right? Is that, if you were allocating resources, you may not choose to allocate it this way. The other thing is to look at the speed with which any particular charity will spend your money. So a lot of charities have money in the bank, as you would expect, and that's prudent for them. Some have much more than others. So this shows you the amount of time, so I worked this out and the calculations are all public, the amount of time that various organisations can keep going if all their revenue stopped today. So the donkey sanctuary would still be going at Christmas, and they'd still be going next summer, and they'd still be going next Christmas, and they'd still be going the summer after next, and they would keep going until about the end of Wimbledon 2014. Which means that, if you put £100 into the donkey sanctuary today, it won't get spent until summer of 2014. Whereas, because they've already got, 2 and a bit years worth of cash in the bank. Whereas, if you were to give it to Oxfam, they've only got 2 months worth, so it'll your money will get spent by the beginning of July. If you put it into Christian Aid, it'll get out by the end of this month. So, clearly, a kind of precise way to think about that for those of you that are economists is around the net present value of your donation. If you put £100 into an organisation that's not going to spend it for several years, then it's going to get kind of inflated away by the time it actually comes to make some difference. So there again is a mechanism by which the way in which you give it makes a big difference to the organisation that you might choose. And lastly, I'm just going to talk about when if you choose to do analysis yourself about which charities are any good, I think there are 6 questions which any good charity should be able to answer. And this is kind of taken from the notion that the impact that an organisation has is a function partly of whether it has a good idea, it has a good approach, and partly whether it is actually good at executing that approach. So to look at whether it has a good idea, you want an organisation that's clear about the problem it's trying to solve, which surprisingly many are not, this is actually not unique to charities, many organisations are not clear on the problem they're trying to solve. You want an organisation which is clear about the activities it does and can articulate how the activities will lead to the results that it's interested in. And that's really about, is there a kind of logic? And often you find that organisations end up doing activities because that's what the money wants them to do, or because, just other, internal politics or external politics, or, why do we do these activities? Well, kind of because we do, rather than because here's the impact that we're actually trying to achieve. And then you want to look at how good are they at implementing it. So, what's the process that you use for researching whether you're making a difference? And there's a lot to say about research processes. What is what results come out of the end of that? There's a huge amount that we could go into about, what results look like. In some of the examples that we've talked about, what are Will's ones and my ones, you'll notice that we've rigged it to talk about results that are easily quantifiable. Often in this world, results are not readily quantifiable. They come in different shapes and sizes that it's quite difficult to squash them into a single metric, and also they appear over very different timescales. So then it's quite difficult to compare them. But you want to know what results they have got. And you also critically, I think, want to know if an organisation is learning and improving. Because the problems on which charities work are hard. They are ones which the private sector hasn't managed to solve, but the public sector hasn't managed to solve. They're ones which the legendary investor Warren Buffett says, quotes, have already resisted great money and often great intellects. And therefore it's vitally important to be learning and improving as we go along to ensure that we get the best results out. So that's what I wanted to talk about. My three sort of golden rules in a way, or the three things that I talk about in my book. So in like a 10-minute guide to good giving. Firstly, that charities vary massively in how good they are. We've seen lots of data about that, and it's really worth just dwelling on that because people really often say, "Oh, it's a charity. It's all for charity. That's great. I just care that it's a real charity." And actually, there's a great deal more to care about than just the fact that something is doing charitable work. Secondly, the admin costs are no indication, so you have to look under the bonnet a bit more thoroughly than that. And thirdly, don't just copy what others are doing because you as a donor, other donors that you see won't naturally know whether you are finding the right organisations and whether you are helping them. Or, as an example I talked at the beginning, of the £5 grant, whether ultimately actually you might be bringing. That's what I wanted to talk about. Thank you. So I think now we're going to take questions.
Yeah, so I'll do the job of fielding them. So any questions? I should say that we're also going to be offering some refreshments later on, so some juice and pizzas out there. So after the questions, we'll invite you to stick around and talk, I guess, in person to the two speakers. But in the meantime, has anyone got any questions that they want to ask now? Yes.
Sorry about stopping you from pizzas and stuff. So how is quality assessed life here assessed? Because I would probably assess the quality of life change very differently, say the way Ben would assess quality of life change. So,
Yeah.
for instance, working with the homeless in the UK to working with children in Africa.
Yeah, that's that's an absolutely great issue. So the way quality adjusted life goes, so in the optimal case, if you were to choose between different interventions, you'd be able to ask every single person, how do you make these sorts of trade-offs, how do you make these sorts of trade-offs? So for each and every person, what are the things they'd want, and they'd have good information about, say, extension of life versus improvement of quality of life. Unfortunately, of course, that would be exceptionally expensive, so you've got to make some sort of simplifications. And so it's like, there's taken as a survey among very many people within the sort of area that you're working in. So if it's the developing world, you'll take a very large amount of survey data from people within the developing world, and then the average used among that. So it's obviously not perfect, but it's quite a good heuristic, close to that kind of idea.
Can I ask that, which is that quality of life are only used in health. So they are only used to compare, this intervention for fixing your broken leg or that intervention for fixing someone else's mental health, whatever. They have never, to my knowledge, been used to compare quite different interventions. So would you like more education, or would you like better housing, or would you like more art galleries, or would you like the rainforest better preserved? To my knowledge, they've never been done. And I discussed this actually in the book about, can you do it? So they work in health, but even there, I alluded to the fact that in any sort of social program, you get results occurring over different time periods, and it's quite difficult to compare them. I think in health, it's a bit more straightforward. Basically, there's an algorithm which people use, and which has been derived from survey data, and it's not without its detractors, and it's quite contentious, because of course it gives different weightings to different things. But the fact is, at least there is an algorithm, and people can see it and argue with it. But there has never been a sort of a universal utility comparison device for comparing different types of things.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the only one economists ever use is willingness to pay, which is insensitive. Yeah, so it's insensitive to how much money you have. So the kind of optimal situation would be something like a well-being adjusted life here, which would unfortunately abbreviate to WALL-E. But where you just took into account all the effects, like having a better sex life, that was something that would make my life better. Without too much information. The girlfriend's coming back from New York soon. That was too much information. So there are very many ways in which you can benefit someone not through health. But qualities at the moment only benefits, only talk about health benefits. So you want, in the ideal world, we have a better benefit.
Yeah, I guess so.
And also, so say you do, you're for the instance, the anti-worming tablets, but what about the children who don't have worms, who do need their parents to be paid to go to them? Do you not think it's a greater good philosophy? Like, could you kill a child to save all the rest of the children in the world? What, that child's not done anything wrong, so don't you think by going for the most cost effective in all instances, you're forgetting about the things which might not be so cost effective, but still are great problems in the world we live?
Good. I mean, this is. I refer to this as the high-hanging fruit problem. So, in the school that I taught in India, there are a certain number of kids whose absenteeism can be solved through the cheap treatment of deworming, right? But you're right, there may be other kids who you can't get to through that mechanism because they haven't got worms or they're very difficult to deworm or whatever, but their parents still keep taking that in. And then, to get them in, you kind of have to go up the sort of ladder of more expensive interventions. And that's where, at some point, you just have to make a call about whether you're going to get, the more expensive people, more expensive children in, or whether you're going to go to another school and deal with the kind of lower hanging fruit. It's when I first came across this problem when I was dealing with a program that was designed to get women back into work, so disadvantaged women into work. And I haven't got the diagram. Can I draw on one of the boards?
Yes, it's can.
Okay. So there, we had, I haven't been academia for a long time, so nothing for a long time. But there, we found that there are some women who, if this is the sort of job unreadiness, no, this is her job unready there. Right, so there are some women who the only thing they need to get them into work is they need, say, some skills, some training on their CV, right? But there may be other women who, to get them into work, they need, some help with their CV and some help with doing interviews. There may be other women who need some help with their CV, some help with interviews, and they might need some help with, childcare. Right? Or there may be other women who need, all of this, and they also need, something else. So then there may be other women who, frankly, may also need some mental health, support because they may have the reason they may be out of work is because they've really been through the mill. Okay? And clearly, these women, if you were in business, these are the women that you would prioritise, right? Because they're the ones that are cheap to solve. You can get them kind of over the touch line, as it were, relatively cheaply. But charities often exist to serve the people who've been sort of left behind by everybody else. Okay, so then they've been left behind precisely because they're expensive to serve. And so they may well need all of these kinds of things. And so, well, here you have I think, a very interesting sort of economic stroke moral problem about, how far up this chain do you go before you say, sorry, honey, you're just too expensive to deal with, And every time you say, okay, I'm going to deal with this expensive woman up here, then that's a bunch of other women down here who, in the neighbouring centres that you're not dealing with. Do you see what I mean? So it's really not trivial, to do this. So in all the examples that Will gave and I gave, they were all rigged, right, to be very directly comparable. But actually, in the real world, you get this all the time. And actually, because again, back to Warren Buffett again, he talks about how there's a nice quote from him that in business you look for things that are easy. So these kinds of things. So in philanthropy, it's quite the opposite. You're going around looking for problems that are expensive and difficult to solve.
Should we move on to
Any other questions? Do you not want to respond to that?
I think we should move on.
How do you get a donor to sort of not stipulate on the money for giving? Because obviously you have to be polite and explain what you need it for, but the point comes where it is their money and you're telling them you don't want them to make conditions on it.
Yeah, it's the same as, how do you get a donor to choose a good charity rather than a bad one? Because ultimately they're not eating the cooking. And what I have found is, generally speaking, if you explain the issues to people and explain the logic, then they will kind of see it. actually, and obviously that's why I hope with the book explains all this stuff. And people write to me quite often saying, "Oh, I never knew that. Actually, you're right." People quite often write and say, "Oh, I always thought admin costs were a good way of looking at it, but now I see, what we're talking about. I don't do that anymore." So information provision. Part of the problem is that charities and social programs are so ill understood in general, and so part of what I and others and Will are doing is just trying to explain kind of what actually goes on inside the black box. And it won't, information has some effect on behaviour. It's not perfect in terms of behaviour change, but it's certainly better than nothing.
Is the research of cost effectiveness of charities up to the donor completely, or is there some sort of go compare for charities?
Oh yeah, there's given what we can is one. So of the two things we do, it's, as well as advocacy, so encouraging people to give more. We do in-depth evaluation of charities and research on charity cost effectiveness, and have recommended charities, where those are at the moment. The very badly named Schistosomiasis Control Initiative, which does this deworming that Caroline talked about, which is extremely cost effective. Deworm the World, which has an even worse name and does the same thing. And Against Malaria Foundation, which distributes insecticides into bed nets. So Give From What We Can is one sort of charity evaluator. Give Well is the other, which is extremely good. They've got really in-depth charity evaluation. And those are the only two charity evaluators I know of that are really thinking about things in the right way. Things like Charity Navigator and GuideStar are just misleading you basically by talking about basically irrelevant things.
The other thing you can do is look at, so I do advocate that people look at the independent analysis, of which I would concur that people by and large short first. But some grant-making trusts and foundations are very good, and they employ a pile of people to understand social and environmental issues in order to determine where that trust spends its money. And you can piggyback on their analysis. So, for example, BBC Children in Need and Comet Relief are both very good. And they both publish lists of organisations that they fund, and if you pick one off there, you'll do all right. And I absolutely advocate that solution. So I took a call this weekend from a senior business guy. Hey, I want to put an organisation in about human rights in my will. What do I do? And I said, well, I talk about this exact issue. I don't know anything about human rights, but I know one or two grant-making foundations who I know are very good. And I also know, and talk about in the book, how to figure out if a grant-making foundation is good, and then you can just copy what they've done.
So, looking at giving as a wider spectrum than just curing diseases, you have things like political advocacy, investing in infrastructure. What do you both think about those things as alternatives to the kind of charity that you've talked about?
So it's a great question. And within Giving What We Can research, so definitely focused on the easiest thing first. So health has a number of benefits in terms of being more easily quantifiable than other things. And also just has a great track record through things like smallpox eradication. But we are doing some research into things like political change. Because it's like, wow, if you can have a one-off investment that makes some change in the global institutional structure, the unjust trade laws, for example, the IMO and so on, you can have an absolutely huge impact. It gets much more difficult to quantify. And so then you have a kind of judgment call. I don't think it's impossible to quantify. You can make some, like if I was God and I knew everything about the world, then I'd know whether it's better to fund certain sorts of political campaigning or not. When it's difficult, then you're in a stickier situation. So suppose you have two classes of interventions, one are unquantifiable, like political change perhaps, or you just don't know how to quantify them, and the other is something like health, where you've got like a reasonably good idea about what's the best. In general, supposing you think, before you've investigated at all, they're about equally promising as intervention classes. In which case, if you give to the unquantifiable one, you're just going to give something like the average cost effectiveness, whereas you can aim for the very best. In contrast, if you just think before investigation, no, political change is going to be way better than health, then it could be the case that you should just fund one, not knowing necessarily it's the best within political change, but you think it could be better than health. I'd be perfectly sympathetic to someone who thought that. On infrastructure in particular, that is again something that's slightly more easily quantifiable. You can quantify it both in terms of health impacts and monetary impacts. It tends not to do as well as many sorts of infrastructure interventions tend not to do as well as medicine. Medicine's kind of amazing, right? You can give someone a pill that costs pennies, like a deworming tablet. You can cure someone for a year. But that's more like a personal question.
Can I offer a slightly different take on that? I don't know what you mean by political change, but if you mean political lobbying for this party versus that party, that is not a legal activity for a charity to be doing in this country. But if you take something in the health world, like helping disabled children, even within that, there are, I think your question is very pertinent. So there are, and I've characterised this using this triangle, which I did not invent. So there are some interventions that you can do that are very proximate to a disabled child. So you could buy a wheelchair for like this disabled child, okay, and you will clearly have a very significant impact on that one disabled child, but you may have zero effect on the disabled child next to them. Okay? So up here, your scope is quite limited. It's very easy to attribute the change to you. There are other types of interventions where you take, as it were, a step away from the child, and you might work with, teachers, say, in their school, or parents, or whatever. In which case, you may have influence over more disabled children. The risk becomes a bit higher because the parents just may or may not listen to what you're talking about. But you may get, the trade-off is that you may get bigger scope. You might take a step, as it were, further away again and work with, say, teacher training colleges to train everybody, all teachers to deal with disabled children. So there, again, you're dealing with more children. So your scope, your scope goes up this way, but it becomes more difficult to attribute any change to you, and your risk goes up as well because, again, it becomes more difficult. There's more chance that simply nothing can come out of the bottom, and then there is work at what we call the bottom of the triangle, where you might be lobbying for, charities are very involved in lobbying for the Disability Discrimination Act, for example, which includes children. So that might be the kind of political change you mean, where if you get it right, if your lobbying is effective, then you influence every disabled child in the land. Okay? So the scope is massive. The risk is really high because, it might work, it might not. And if it does work, it's quite hard to attribute that to you. So this is sort of what I mean, that even in the health world, where you can shove stuff into the quality analysis, this isn't to detract from it, but it's something to be aware of, is you have a hard time comparing those kinds of interventions, because qualities don't have any mechanism for, the algorithm has no place for risk in it. Right? So at some level, where which charity you choose, the charities vary on where they are on this triangle, it's sort of a matter of taste. There are some organisations that kind of work down here. So, Transparency International, for example, which looks at governance and accountability, isn't working with disabled children at all, but it is working on sort of meta issues, across the whole system. And again, my preference is for things that are at the bottom, and I think that philanthropic money uniquely can do stuff at the bottom. It's very hard for commercial money to do this, and it's very hard for public money to do it. But philanthropic money uniquely is able to do that.
What about giving now or giving later? Because you can earn money on interest and stuff, and then more of a difference later.
Yeah, so that's one of my favourite questions. So this is actually a really difficult problem. And okay, so you might think the following: I've got £1 I can give now, but I could put it in the stock market for an index fund. Get compound interest. That means I double my money every sort of 20 years or something. And you might think ethically, I would just, one person suffering in 10 years' time, they matter just as much as one person suffering now. In which case, if I save the money and then give it to charity later, then I've done a much larger benefit. I've done twice the benefit. That reasoning isn't so simple, I don't think, for a variety of reasons. One is you might not actually give the money in the future. You can get around that by tying yourself to the mast in various ways. But the other thing is that if you give now, then you actually have a social rate of return. So money compounds if you give it in the same way that compounds if you put it in a stock market. Because you give, for example, a health benefit to people in the developing world, it means they can earn more, there's a there's a multiplier effect, and that means that other people earn more as well. And in fact, it seems to be likely that the social rate of return beats the market, because it doesn't have to come back to you. There is one big reason, though, in terms of why you might want to save money and give it later, which is that all this evidence that we have, that we've been talking about in terms of cost-effective giving, it's all in its infancy. People really haven't been thinking about this for a very long time. And it might well be the case that the sort of evidence we have about the best ways to help other people is just significantly better in 5 or 10 years' time. So it might be that if you save your money, you can give it somewhere 10 times or 20 times or 100 times better if you wait 5 years. So it's an incredibly difficult question how those things balance out. But it's an awesome unsolved problem.
So following on from that, how does sort of emergency relief compare to say sort of structural change, like treating worms compared to say treating victims of a war that's going on now or trying to,
Yeah.
like,
yeah, so there has been analysis done on this, mainly by GWWC, not by us. It seems like, so every single case of emergency relief is going to be different, and so you can't really generalise. Of the ones that have been looked into, generally fare quite poorly compared to more mundane interventions like deworming. The reason primarily being that emergency relief just gets huge amounts of funding relative to things that are less sexy like deworming. I mean, if there's a fire or earthquake or tsunami, is just like incredibly salient, and so they're able to get far more donations. And in fact, and again, you might think it's difficult to quantify, but actually I think the effect is so great that you can make some basic calculations. Like what GiveWell did with Haiti was just say, okay, look at all the money that's been donated to Haiti. What's the population of Haiti? Divide one figure by the other, and assume that all the aid money is saved in every member of Haiti's life. Does that beat? So incredibly, like absurdly conservative estimates in favour of emergency relief. Would that be a better health intervention or better intervention than the best health interventions in sub-Saharan Africa? And the answer was no. So that's the way that you can think. That's like one way of illustrating the fact ways you can quantify things that you might think are unquantifiable. Because you just say, okay, we have these ridiculously conservative assumptions. Does that give us a little better?
And you often get that, and you're absolutely right, I think there's that analysis. But it's often the case that it's easier to raise money for when there is a problem than for preventing a problem.
Yeah.
Because, it's not very telegenic to show preventing a problem. So, to the point about often like intelligent philanthropic money does things that nobody else is doing. It does this stuff that's about infrastructure, it does this stuff that's about system change, and it can find these kinds of preventing problems.
I'm really impressed with the research that you've done, it's really good. But coming back to some of the first points that you made about, you gave the kind of example of giving donuts to police officers. I think you're forgetting, what I've noticed, especially being at university and I studied physics for a while and gave it up, is that mathematicians and physicists, if they can't measure something, they think it doesn't exist. And I think the problem is that you can't quantify happiness and things like love. You can't quantify that. So if you said it costs £12 to buy, to cure someone with smallpox, I know that it costs about 10p to buy a donut at Tesco's. If I bought 120 donuts and gave them to all the police officers at the student riots when that guy was killed with the baton, maybe it would have saved his life. But you won't be able to calculate that, so you think it doesn't exist. When actually, if you did support police officers, it could save lives, and it does, because they already have support groups for police officers.
Okay, so importantly, like if something's unquantifiable, definitely doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just it's an epistemic problem rather than something out there. I think something like comparing donuts with smallpox could be quantified. In particular, you could ask someone about the sort of trade-offs they make, so including even the police officer or someone's life. How much is this donut worth to you in terms of risk of death, for example. So would you, okay, I'm going to give you a donut and it's going to give you a 1 in 10 risk of death. I'd probably say no to the donut. 1 in 100 would probably still say no. And you could keep going with that sort of trade-offs. It might get difficult to get small amounts of money. But similarly, you could look at, you could do a study of if you were to give donuts to police officers, like how many lives did that save, or how many lives didn't it save, and so on. And you might think, okay, well, we shouldn't value lives equally. Perhaps some lives are more valuable than others. I kind of personally don't think that's true, but even if you do, then when comparing the sorts of interventions you can have in the developed world and the developing world, you have to make claims like, oh, lives in the developed world are 100 times more valuable than those in the developing world. So you've got to make quite strong claims about having living lives. If you to say that, like, it's more important to save lives in the developed world than the developing world.
Yeah, it comes down
Although
to...
many interventions are not about saving lives. So, art galleries or, preserving rainforests or whatever, just completely different categories of thing. And so, I agree they are extremely difficult, stroke impossible to quantify. Which kind of comes back to your point about why isn't there some sort of quality type algorithm that covers everything? Because, because it would just be horrendous.
It's an obsession. No, it's not horrendous at all, because we already have the inbuilt systems for us to be able to figure out things like love. We know that love exists, but we just can't quantify it. And it's a physicist's and mathematician's obsession to quantify things. And typically, you'll notice that mathematicians and physicists aren't very loving. I wouldn't go that far, but
Well,
what I will say an important point is that my best friend's a police officer, and the things that he tells me and the experiences that he's seen, listening to him, maybe I wouldn't give him a donut, like that would be just like a token gesture, and it is a way for you to cash in on a cliche of police officers eating donuts in order to kind of rile people up to donate to Africa as opposed to our police officers. But if you were to create a police officer support group and then listen to the stories that they have about seeing people dying, seeing people, like some of the stories that I've heard, it's just absolutely horrendous. And you can't pay people to go around to police officers and listen to their stories. You can, it's called counselling. But if you convince people, if you influence people to be more loving towards people, then my friend, when he's coming up against someone who's, committed a crime, he won't then physically abuse him as much. And I know for a fact that's confidential between me and him, but he's in a position of power with his job. And when someone isn't treating him fairly, he is in a position to abuse them, and there is police abuse out there. So I think, so I think you're kind of missing a crucial fact there with trying to quantify everything and not looking at the things that you can't quantify.
I'm sure no disrespect for police.
No.
Do you want
I don't know
that?
Yeah, so it's kind of similar. So I was choosing donuts and police officers. It's a deliberately tame sort of cliche. But the important thing is, like I mentioned before, it's not that unquantifiable doesn't exist. But if you're funding something less unquantifiable, you have to think that it's really likely to do more good to help other people. Unless you kind of reject the principle that you want to help more people rather than less. But that's kind of fundamental to our approach. And it's just an option between, well, do I go for something I know is the best in that specific area, or do I go for something and I'm just really not sure what to do? And when it's about like something as horrific as abuse or anything like that, or something as horrific as living in extreme poverty or suffering from HIV/AIDS, then it seems to me like, it seems to me like really quite like we have a kind of moral obligation to make sure that what our money's doing is like doing a lot of good. And so you might think that actually just the safer bet is what to go for. But I wouldn't kind of enforce that.
Okay, we're just going to take 2 more questions. I noticed 2 at the back. Dean, did you?
No, I'm all right now, thanks.
Anyone else? Don't.
When you talk about wastage, like when you had the example of 95% wastage, do you because obviously that kind of corruption has an effect on the quality of human life. Either it can be used to fund arms companies or something like that. It can be taken out, and therefore it's not just neutral. So it will have an effect. And how do you look at that in terms of
Oh my God.
the problems of
Okay,
wastage?
so I was using that example simply to demonstrate that even if you think that administration is waste, right, which by the way it isn't, but even if you had that mentality and you saw an organisation which had 95% admin costs, that still doesn't show you that it's not a good organisation. That it's not. So here we have two organisations. One has 0% admin costs or waste. One has 95%, which is the better. Oh my God, it's the one that's got 95%. Right. So I was using it for that. Now clearly, if you actually found an organisation which was, pissing 95% of its money up the wall, you would have some pretty major questions to ask. But you may find an organisation which is, we might be doing a deworming project, but it might be doing it and there might be a flood that destroys a load of its tablets, or there might be a theft, or there might be, a fire, or whatever. So there might be sort of like bona fide wastage, sort of thing. So, even so, the maths, the maths of kind of inputs into an organisation, or the maths of its cost base, don't align with the maths of whether it's impacted any or not. Your question is also getting into the kind of bigger question about sort of unintended consequences of an organisation, and if we start on that, we should go on that.
Okay, one more. Yes.
Hi, I don't remember who it was, but somebody was talking about Go compared to charities, and I'm not sure what you meant this, but as in a company that just analyzes the charitable sector. But there's also another sector which is basically big government, international NGOs like Interpol, the whole UN organization. What do you think of the organizations that do with charity in that sector, and what would you say about the validity of their research?
The validity of UN research into charities? Is that your question?
Yeah. So were you asking about the assessment of kind of like overseas development aid, things like that?
Along those lines.
So I've never looked at like the UN or whatever assessment of charities, and to my knowledge they don't make it public, so it's not accessible. DFIDs I don't think it's public. But certainly, if your question is about are there people independently who analyse organisations that operate internationally, then yeah, absolutely. Given what we can does, GWWC does, and some of the development interesting foundations do.
And if you were, so there's also then analysis on overseas development aid, so money that's given not by charities but by governments and so on. Was that what you were asking about? Yeah, so that in fact gets discussed an awful lot more than NGOs. All the kind of big development economists are always talking about overseas development aid. And it's something that varies. It tends to be pretty bad. Especially USAID is like a classic example that by law, any products or all overseas development aid had to be spent on products bought from the US. So there's an awful lot of problems to do with tagged donations, also politically aimed donations, because when governments of countries donate on aid, they've always got political motive behind it. So the US, for example, most of its overseas development aid goes to Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan. Very little goes to countries like Ethiopia. There's a huge amount of kind of research that's done this.
Okay, great. Sorry, that's all we've got time. We want to talk to the speakers afterwards, I'm sure they'll hang around for a bit. Just join me again in thanking both our speakers, Caroline and Will.